What if the darkest secret your family kept wasn't a stolen fortune or a murder, but you? For 20 years, she was locked in a freezing tower, branded a genetic failure. But when the continent's most ruthless Alpha King tore down her family's gates, he didn't come for their gold. He came for her. Historical records from the 12th century often speak of the brutal, relentless winters of the northern territories, but they rarely mention the monsters hiding inside the warm, fire-lit castles. In the year 1142, House Croft was one of the wealthiest werewolf lineages in the realm. Led by Lord Thomas Croft, they were a family of purebloods, known for their massive, silver-furred wolves and their ruthless political cunning. To the outside world, Lord Thomas was a grieving widower who had bravely remarried the elegant Lady Catherine, raising 2 beautiful daughters. But this was a lie, a carefully orchestrated, horrific lie. There was only one daughter presented to society, the golden-haired, fierce Harriet. The other daughter, Gwendolen, did not exist. At least, not on paper, not at banquets, and certainly not in the eyes of the pack. Gwendolen Croft was considered broken. In lycanthrope society during the Middle Ages, a wolf was expected to shift for the first time by their 18th winter. It was a brutal coming-of-age ritual. Those who failed to shift were branded as dull bloods, genetic dead ends who possessed the heightened senses of a wolf but the fragile body of a human. They were considered a stain on a pure-blood family's honor, often exiled to the wilderness to die. But Lord Thomas was a proud man, and executing his own flesh and blood would draw too many questions. Instead, when Gwendolen turned 18 and her bones refused to break and reform under the full moon, her father and stepmother devised a quieter, more cruel solution. They erased her, the Eastern Keep. Gwendolen was moved in the dead of night to the Eastern Keep of the Croft estate, a crumbling, drafty stone tower that had been abandoned for decades. Her world, which had once been filled with riding horses and studying maps, shrank to a single, circular room with a heavy oak door locked from the outside. Her living conditions were designed to break her spirit. Isolation. She was forbidden from speaking to the servants. Her meals were pushed through a small iron grate at the bottom of the door. The cold. The hearth in her room was deliberately kept small, forcing her to rely on threadbare wool blankets during the freezing northern winters. The gas lighting. Lady Catherine would occasionally visit, not to bring comfort, but to whisper venom. She told Gwendolen that the pack wanted her dead, that her father wept with shame because of her, and that the only reason she was kept alive was out of their profound, misplaced mercy. Gwendolen lived like a ghost for 2 long years. She grew thin, her pale skin devoid of sunlight, her dark hair long and unkempt. But despite the psychological torment, Gwendolen possessed an ironclad will. She didn't cry. She survived. She spent her days tracking the sunbeams that crawled across the stone floor and listening. Because she couldn't shift, her family assumed her wolf senses were dead. They were wrong. Her hearing was incredibly sharp. Through the thick stone walls, she listened to the whispers of the castle guards, the gossip of the scullery maids, and the political machinations of her father. That was how she learned about the coming of King Alistair. The Conqueror approaches. King Alistair of the Iron Peak Mountains was a nightmare clad in armor and fur. At 28, he was the Alpha King of the entire continent, a massive, scarred warrior who had united the warring packs through sheer, unadulterated violence. It was said his wolf was the size of a warhorse, black as pitch, with eyes like burning coals. By the autumn of 1144, Alistair's army was marching south, demanding fealty from the independent noble houses. House Croft was next. Panic gripped the Croft estate. Lord Thomas knew his meagre army could not withstand a siege against the Iron Peak forces. He needed a treaty. More specifically, he needed an alliance forged in blood. He planned to offer his prized daughter, Harriet, as a bride to the Alpha King. If Harriet became queen, House Croft would not just survive. They would rule the South. For weeks, the castle was a flurry of desperate preparation. 1. The great hall was scrubbed and decorated with the finest tapestries. 2. The vaults were opened, pulling out ancient silver chalices and gold to offer as tribute. 3. Harriet was groomed relentlessly, dressed in silks, and trained in the political etiquette of the Iron Peak court. But in the Eastern Keep, Lady Catherine delivered a chilling warning to Gwendolen. "The king arrives tomorrow," her stepmother hissed through the iron grate, her eyes glinting with malice. "He is a savage who slaughters the weak. If he hears so much as a floorboard creak in this tower, if he discovers a defective, dull blood hiding in our home, he will burn this entire castle to the ash. Do not move. Do not cough. Do not breathe too loudly. If you ruin this for your sister, I will unlock this door and slit your throat myself." Gwendolen sat in the freezing dark, clutching her knees to her chest. She had no intention of weighing the king's wrath. She just wanted to survive. But destiny, especially in the medieval world of wolves, is rarely swayed by the plans of cruel men. The arrival of King Alistair was not marked by joyous trumpets, but by a deafening, earth-shaking howl that rattled the very foundations of the Croft Castle. From her narrow window in the tower, Gwendolen watched as hundreds of massive wolves broke through the tree line, shifting seamlessly into imposing, battle-hardened men and women as they approached the gates. At the center rode King Alistair. Even from a distance, Gwendolen felt a strange, terrifying jolt in her chest. He was a giant of a man, clad in dark steel and thick furs, his expression as cold and unforgiving as a glacier. Beside him rode his beta, a formidable warrior named Gideon. Lord Thomas, sweating profusely despite the freezing rain, greeted the king in the courtyard, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the mud. "Welcome, my king, to House Croft. Our home is yours," Thomas declared, his voice trembling slightly. Alistair didn't smile. He merely dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "We will see about that, Lord Croft. Let us hope your hospitality matches your reputation." The Feast of Lies. That evening, the great hall was filled with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and palpable fear. King Alistair sat at the head table, radiating a heavy, suffocating alpha aura that forced the Croft Pack members to keep their heads bowed. When the time was right, Lord Thomas presented his masterpiece. The massive oak doors opened, and Harriet walked in, flanked by musicians. She was undeniably beautiful, wearing a crimson gown that complemented her golden hair, her chin held high with practiced confidence. "My king," Thomas announced proudly, "may I present my only daughter, Harriet, the pride of our bloodline." Harriet approached the table, bowing gracefully, offering her neck in a traditional sign of submission to an alpha. It was the perfect, calculated move to win a mate. Alistair looked at her. He tilted his head, breathing in her scent. Silence stretched across the hall. Lady Catherine held her breath, her nails digging into the wooden table. This was the moment they secured their royal future. But Alistair's dark eyes narrowed. His wolf, a primordial entity of instinct and power, felt absolutely nothing for the woman standing before him. She smelled of expensive perfumes and desperation. "She is beautiful, Lord Croft," Alistair said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed in the quiet hall. "But she is not my mate." Harriet's smile faltered. Thomas stammered, My king, surely an alliance." Alistair raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The king reached for his goblet of wine, intending to dismiss the conversation. But as he lifted the cup to his lips, a sudden gust of wind blew through the high windows of the great hall, extinguishing several torches. And then it hit him. It was faint. So incredibly faint, it was almost buried beneath the smell of roasted meat and the sweat of terrified lords. But to an alpha king, it was like a beacon in the dead of night. Petrichor, rain hitting dry earth, pine needles, and a hint of wild, sweet honey. Alistair's wine goblet dropped from his hand, shattering on the stone floor. Red wine pooled like blood. The entire hall went dead silent, terrified they had offended the volatile king. Alistair stood up slowly, his chest heaving. His pupils blew wide, the human brown bleeding into a terrifying, luminous gold. His wolf was clawing at the surface, thrashing, roaring a single word in his mind. "Where is she?" Alistair growled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Lord Thomas stepped back, terrified. "Where is who, my king? You are looking at Harriet." "Do not play games with me, old man," Alistair snarled, vaulting over the heavy wooden table in a single, terrifying motion. He grabbed Lord Thomas by the collar of his tunic, lifting the man off his feet. "There is a scent in this castle, a scent that belongs to my soul. Who else is in this keep?" Lady Catherine stood up, her face drained of all colour. "No one, Your Grace. Only the servants." Alistair dropped Thomas and turned toward the massive stone hallway. His wolf was in full control now. He began to stalk through the castle, following the faint ribbon of scent. Gideon and the Iron Peak guards immediately drew their swords, following their king, while the Croft family scrambled behind them in sheer panic. The broken door. Alistair's path bypassed the grand bedchambers, bypassed the servants' quarters, and headed straight for the abandoned, freezing corridors of the eastern keep. "My king, please," Thomas pleaded, running to catch up. "There is nothing down there but dust and old stonework. It is not safe." Alistair ignored him. He reached the heavy oak door of the tower. It was barred from the outside with a heavy iron padlock. The scent of rain and honey was overwhelming here. It was intoxicating. It was driving his wolf to the brink of madness. "Open it," Alistair commanded. "We don't have the key," Lady Catherine lied frantically. "It was lost years ago." Alistair didn't wait. He stepped back and unleashed a brutal kick. The thick wood splintered, the iron padlock groaning before snapping in half. With a second kick, the door exploded inward off its hinges, crashing onto the cold stone floor of the cell. The king stepped into the freezing, dimly lit room. There, huddled in the corner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was Gwendolen. She was trembling vilely, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the massive, golden-eyed monster standing in her doorway. She looked frail, malnourished, and terrified. Alistair stopped dead in his tracks. The terrifying warlord king of the continent dropped to his knees on the freezing stone. His golden eyes softened instantly, filled with an agonizing mix of reverence and fury. "Mate," he whispered, a sound so gentle it shocked his own guards. Lord Thomas and Lady Catherine arrived at the doorway, panting. When they saw the king kneeling before their defective daughter, the blood drained from their faces. "Your Grace," Thomas stammered, practically vibrating with terror. You do not want her. She is a defect, a dull blood. She hasn't even shifted. She is a stain on our lineage." In a fraction of a second, Alistair moved. He crossed the room, grabbed Lord Thomas by the throat, and slammed him against the stone wall with enough force to crack the masonry. "You locked my queen in a cage?" Alistair's voice was no longer human. It was the demonic, overlapping growl of a fully realized alpha. "You starved the other half of my soul." "Wait!" Lady Catherine screamed, stepping forward in a desperate, fatal mistake. "She isn't just a dull blood. She is diseased. If you take her, she will weaken your bloodline. It is why we kept her away. She is broken." Alistair threw Thomas to the floor. He slowly turned his gaze to Lady Catherine. "I was a master of war, but he was also a master of reading his enemies." He looked at Gwendolyn's pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes, and then looked back at the stepmother. "She is not broken," Alistair said coldly, his eyes narrowing as the twisted puzzle pieces fell into place. He stepped closer to Catherine, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "She is suppressed." A collective gasp echoed from the Iron Peak guards. Alistair turned his head to his beta. "Gideon, search the kitchens. Check the spice cabinets, the apothecaries, the private chambers of this vile woman. Tell me what you find." 10 agonizing minutes passed in silence. Alistair remained in the cell, taking off his heavy fur cloak and wrapping it gently around Gwendolyn's trembling shoulders. She flinched at his touch, but the warmth of his skin sent a bizarre, comforting shockwave through her chest. Gideon returned, holding a small, unassumingly carved wooden box. "Found hidden beneath a floorboard in Lady Catherine's quarters, sire," Gideon said, his face contorted in disgust. He opened the box to reveal crushed, dark purple petals. "Wolfsbane," Alistair growled, confirming his suspicion. The twist was agonizingly clear, and the truth of the Croft family's betrayal laid bare. Gwendolyn wasn't a dull blood. She hadn't failed to shift because she was genetically defective. Lady Catherine had been secretly slipping micro-doses of crushed wolfsbane into Gwendolyn's food and tea since she was 12 years old. Wolfsbane, a highly toxic poison to lycanthropes, was lethal in high doses, but in tiny chronic amounts over years, it acted as a chemical prison, slowly paralyzing the inner wolf, keeping Gwendolyn trapped in a perpetually sick human state, all to ensure that Catherine's biological daughter, Harriet, would be the only rival for the pack's inheritance. They hadn't just hidden Gwendolyn. They had systematically poisoned her for a decade. Alistair stood up, his eyes burning with a rage that would soon become legendary across the continent. He looked at the cowering Lord and Lady of House Croft and delivered a sentence that would change the course of their history forever. The silence that followed King Alistair's realization was heavier than stone. The shattered pieces of the wooden box lay on the floor, the crushed purple petals of the wolfsbane, a damning testament to a decade of torture. Alistair's golden eyes swept over Lord Thomas and Lady Catherine. He did not draw his sword. A quick death was far too merciful for what they had done to his mate. "You have committed treason against the crown by plotting to poison a royal." Alistair's voice was a lethal, quiet rasp. "But more than that, you have committed an atrocity against the goddess herself. You attempted to smother a true wolf." "Mercy, your grace," Lord Thomas sobbed, falling to his knees. "It was Catherine's doing. I only turned a blind eye." Lady Catherine shrieked, backing away toward the door, but Gideon and the king's guards instantly blocked her path. Harriet, the golden child, stood paralyzed in the hallway, watching her grand future crumble into ash. "There is no mercy for those who steal the sun from their own kin," Alistair declared. He turned to Gideon. "Strip them of their silks. Confiscate the Croft fortune. Lord Thomas and Lady Catherine are to be locked inside this very tower. Let them survive on the scraps of the scullery, with the hearth unlit and the winter winds howling through the cracks. Let them live the exact life they forced upon their daughter." He looked at Harriet, who whimpered under his terrifying gaze. "And you, the false bride. You are exiled from these lands. If you ever set foot in the northern territories again, you will be hunted for sport." The guards seized the screaming lord and lady, dragging them into the freezing cell. Alistair did not stay to watch the door lock behind them. He turned his attention back to the trembling woman wrapped in his heavy fur cloak. Gwendolen stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent 2 years in this expecting to die. Now the most dangerous man on the continent was looking at her as if she were made of spun glass. "We are leaving this cursed place," Alistair whispered softly, kneeling before her. He scooped her frail body into his arms without waiting for a reply. She weighed practically nothing, a tragic consequence of her malnourishment. Gwendolen rested her head against his broad chest, the intoxicating scent of pine and rain overwhelming her senses. For the first time in 20 years, she felt safe. The road to Iron Peak and the poison's toll. The journey back to the Iron Peak Mountains was grueling, not because of the harsh terrain, but because of the horrific reality of Gwendolen's condition. Once the daily microdoses of wolfsbane were stopped, her body began to violently purge the toxins. It was an excruciating withdrawal. For weeks in the royal carriage, and later in the grand chambers of the king's mountain fortress, Gwendolen suffered through blinding fevers, terrifying hallucinations, and agonizing bone aches. Her suppressed wolf, dormant for so long, was thrashing against the chemical chains, trying to claw its way to the surface. Alistair refused to leave her side. The ruthless warlord became a devoted caretaker. He bathed her feverish skin in ice water, forced nutrient-dense broths past her chapped lips, and held her when the pain caused her to scream. To ensure her survival, Alistair contracted the finest minds in the realm, calling upon the secretive physicians of the Order of St. John, a real private brotherhood of elite hospitaller monks who possessed ancient texts on lycanthropic biology. Brother Bartholomew, the head of the order, arrived at Iron Peak with cases of rare antidotes and purifying salts. "The poison has interwoven with her nervous system, Your Grace," Brother Bartholomew explained gravely one evening, mixing a poultice of activated charcoal and crushed willow bark. "Her body has forgotten how to be a wolf, the first time she shifts, The sheer force of the awakened magic might stop her heart. She must be grounded by a true mate's bond, or she will not surmount the transition. Alistair looked at Gwendolyn's sleeping, pale face. He took her frail hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles. She will survive, Alistair vowed, his eyes glowing with fierce determination. She has fought the dark her entire life. I will not let it take her now. As winter turned to early spring, the purifying treatments of the Hospitallers began to work. Gwendolyn's hollow cheeks filled out. Her dull, matted hair transformed into a cascade of rich, shining raven locks. And most importantly, the dull ache in her soul began to ignite into a blazing fire. She could feel her wolf. It was pacing, hungry and ancient. But as Gwendolyn healed, a dark storm was brewing at the borders of the king's territory. Harriet had not taken her exile with the grace of a defeated woman. Stripped of her wealth and her pride, the rejected sister had traveled south, her heart twisted by a venomous cocktail of jealousy and vengeance. She managed to secure a massive loan from the southern lords who despised Alistair's iron grip on the continent. With this gold, Harriet hired the Breton Vanguard, a ruthless, highly trained private mercenary company known for specializing in hunting lycanthropes using weapons forged of pure silver. Her plan was simple and desperate: assassinate King Alistair during the upcoming spring equinox moon claim. Gwendolyn died in the crossfire and usurped the throne under the backing of the southern lords. The night of the equinox, the spring equinox, was the night Gwendolyn was destined to finally shift. The pull of the moon was a tidal wave in her blood. Alistair had taken her to the sacred Moonstone Grove, an ancient clearing deep in the mountains, shielded by towering pines and ancient magic. Gideon and the Royal Guard were stationed a mile away. A mate's first shift was a deeply intimate, private rite of passage that required absolute isolation. "Do not fear the pain, my heart," Alistair murmured, standing barefoot in the snow, his hands resting on Gwendolyn's shoulders. The full moon was rising, massive and luminous. "Let the beast tear through the cage. I am right here." Gwendolyn gasped as the first wave hit her. It felt as though lightning had struck her spine. She fell to her knees, clutching the snow. The sound of her bones cracking and snapping was violently loud in the quiet grove. She screamed, but the scream mutated into a guttural, terrifying snarl. But just as the transformation reached its brutal climax, the silence of the grove was shattered. Thwack! A silver-tipped crossbow bolt buried itself deep into Alistair's shoulder. The king roared in pain, stumbling back as the toxic silver burned his flesh. From the shadows of the tree line, 30 heavily armed Breton Vanguard mercenaries poured into the clearing, their silver swords gleaming in the moonlight. At the rear stood Harriet, wrapped in stolen furs, her eyes manic with triumph. "Kill the beast!" Harriet shrieked, pointing at Alistair. "And bring me my sister's head." Alistair, despite the silver poisoning his blood, shifted instantly into his massive, pitch-black wolf. He tore into the first wave of mercenaries with devastating fury, crushing armor and snapping necks. But there were too many. Another silver bolt pierced his flank, and a mercenary drove a silver-laced spear through his hind leg. The Alpha King collapsed into the blood-stained snow, snarling defiantly as the mercenaries closed in for the kill. Harriet stepped forward, a silver dagger in her hand, intending to finish her sister herself while the beast was distracted. She looked toward the spot where Gwendolen had fallen, but the snow was empty. A low, rumbling vibration shook the earth. It wasn't just a growl. It was a sound that seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. From the shadows of the ancient monoliths stepped a creature of absolute mythological terror and beauty. Gwendolen had not shifted into a frail, stunted wolf. The decades of suppression had acted like a pressure cooker, concentrating her bloodline's ancient magic. She was a towering, majestic beast, larger even than Alistair. But what made the mercenaries drop their weapons in sheer, paralyzed dread was her coat. She was not brown, nor black, nor grey. She was pure, luminescent silver. Gwendolen possessed the blood of the Luna Argentum, the first matriarchs of the werewolf race, a lineage thought to be extinct for 1,000 years. Her eyes burned like brilliant, white-hot stars. Mine, the silver wolf's voice echoed directly into the minds of everyone in the clearing, carrying the crushing weight of a demigod. The slaughter that followed was swift and merciless. Gwendolen moved faster than the human eye could track. She became a blur of silver and claws, tearing through the Breton vanguard like wet paper. Silver weapons shattered against her impossibly dense fur. She didn't just fight, she eradicated them. Within 2 minutes, the elite mercenary company was reduced to a pile of broken armor and silence in the snow. Harriet dropped her dagger, her knees giving out. She fell into the snow, weeping in absolute terror as the massive silver wolf stalked toward her. Gwendolen's jaws were coated in crimson, her white eyes fixed on her tormentor. She could have bitten her sister in half. The beast demanded blood for 20 years of stolen life. But as Gwendolen looked at the pathetic, sniveling woman who had tried to poison her soul, she felt something stronger than vengeance. She felt pity. Gwendolen let out a deafening roar that sent Harriet scurrying backward in the snow, then turned her back on her sister. Death was too easy. Let Harriet live with the knowledge that the sister she called broken was practically a god. Gwendolen trotted over to Alistair. The black wolf was bleeding heavily, but he forced himself to stand, gazing at his mate in absolute awe and reverence. Gwendolen nuzzled her massive silver head against his neck, her magical aura already neutralizing the silver in his wounds. When Gideon and the royal guards finally broke through the tree line, they stopped dead in their tracks. They immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads into the snow. They were not just bowing to the king. They were bowing to the legendary Silver Queen. House Croft had tried to bury Gwendolen in the dark, but they had forgotten one simple, immutable truth about the wild. You cannot hide the moon, and you can never break a true survivor. She rose from the ashes of a poisoned childhood to become the most powerful queen the continent had ever known, ruling the north with an iron claw and a just heart, forever bound to the Alpha King who had loved her in the dark. What a journey! From a freezing, forgotten tower to ruling as the legendary Silver Queen of the continent, Gwendolen's story proves that the strongest spirits can never be broken, no matter how much poison is poured into their lives. If you were captivated by this epic tale of betrayal, undeniable soulmates, and ultimate revenge, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce underdog, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling romantic dramas.